Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the meeting of the Task Force to Reimagine Policing in Brookline for Friday, October 30th. I'm Raul Fernandez, Select Board member and chair of this task force. I'm here with all of our task force members and the able staff that are here to support our work. Just looking at the agenda for our meeting, so everyone's clear on what's happening today. We've got some opportunity for announcements if there are any. We'll be doing some approval of meeting minutes, and then we're going to go into subcommittee updates. Each subcommittee will have an opportunity to update us on their work to date. We'll have an update and discussion on the policing survey that we're engaging with Tufts University on, and then hopefully some time for new business. Let's open the floor. Any announcements or updates that folks would like to share? All right. Seeing none, there'll be another opportunity if there's something that you forgot about. You can let us know later on, maybe during new business. Meeting minutes. You should have received the meeting minutes for Friday, October 2nd, Friday, October 9th, and Friday, October 16th. Does anyone have at this point, generally speaking, we like to send these edits in advance to Devin. Does anyone have any edits or any additions they'd like to make now? Seeing none, I'm going to, unless there's objection, I'd like to approve all 3 minutes in omnibus fashion. So we'll just take one vote on all 3 minutes, sets of minutes, and we'll do that now. Once again, if everybody can just unmute for this period of time, that'll make it a lot faster. So all those in favor of approving the minutes for October 2nd, October 9th, and October 16th, say aye. Anne?
Aye.
Aye. Kristen?
Aye.
Eitan?
Aye.
Malcolm?
Aye.
Mike?
Aye.
Almas?
Aye.
Chi-Chi?
Aye.
Kimberly?
Aye.
Alexander?
Aye.
And Bonnie?
Aye.
Did I miss anyone? I don't think so. Okay. And the chair votes aye, miss myself. So those are all approved. Let's move right into the meat of our discussion today, which are the subcommittee updates. The first one I have on our list here is departmental analysis. Eitan, would you like to lead that?
Sure. I think we had a productive meeting last week, and we have one scheduled for a couple weeks from now. We have a plan to, we have a kind of a few, we have I think a good division of labor. Everyone's kind of doing something between now and the next couple weeks, really looking at parts of the police department that other committees I think are not touching upon. And so we're going to kind of put together some reports of that for our next subcommittee meeting. I personally met with Chief O'Leary earlier in the week to talk about the piece that I've kind of broken off for myself in our subcommittee about how the department basically gets new ideas and adopts them from other departments and other organizations, from rank and file officers, and most importantly from community members. Try to put some kind of where we are now and what that should look like in the future. And I know Chi-Chi and Raul are also working on components of this as well.
And Mike too.
Mike too, sorry, Mike too.
Yeah, that's all right. Chi-Chi, you want to weigh in?
I submitted some material to Devin that I put together, including a spreadsheet that looks at different communities, some in Massachusetts that are comparable in size to Brookline, some that are bigger, and then a couple of communities outside of Massachusetts, just all sorts of statistics about, what's the police budget, as far as I can see, number of officers, crime data, and just put it in spreadsheets so if we can glean any insights from it. And a link to that I think should have been posted in the notice of the subcommittee meeting, if anyone wants to look at it, plus some articles, including one about Cambridge and their proposal to move traffic enforcement to civilian employees. And Devin has noted, yes, the link is up there if anybody wants to see the spreadsheet. I've also put a Google Doc up that will allow the committee to, it's publicly viewable but not editable, and then it'll be editable by subcommittee members.
Not edible.
Not edible. Editable. It is 8 a.m. I have not had a full cup of coffee.
I won't make jokes about bites or anything like that. Mike Sandman, anything to add here?
No, to be perfectly honest, I've been buried in getting the combined reports ready for town meeting. So we just finished that. Next week and the week after, I will go to work.
Phenomenal. Yeah, I think one of the essential questions for this subcommittee is, does the scope and scale of our department meet the needs of our community? And so you see us addressing that question in different ways in terms of, how the department gets new ideas, looking at, size and budget, those kinds of things, as well as this important piece around traffic enforcement, which is, a great deal of the work that police officers engage in currently. So we'll be tracking all of that down. Questions for folks in this subcommittee from the rest of the task force?
Actually, I'd like to add one more thing.
Please.
On the discussion of what Eitan was talking about how the department gets new ideas, I think some of us were, or at least myself, were thinking the discussion could go broader than that. At one point, there was an analogy made about how the school committee is the governance for the school department and whether there should be a similar structure for the police department, a civilian governance structure.
Yeah, we talked, Chief O'Leary and I had an initial conversation about that, and specifically on that parallel with the schools. So yeah, I agree.
Okay.
There's obviously lots of reasons why it's not a perfect analogy between kind of teacher or school oversight and police oversight, but I think that's a good starting point.
Now, some folks would ask, isn't that the select board that plays that role?
That was going to be my question.
So, right, the way we talked about in our department analysis subcommittee meeting is that, a teacher at a school has multiple parts of citizen oversight. There's an official representation and a discussion with, say, the town leadership that is often oppositional. In other words, budgetary or salary, and that's not the role of ordinary citizens to have a role. But there's also a lot of input that comes from parents to teachers, and there's organization to support that, and that's a different kind of oversight and accountability that I don't think it's instead of elected town officials providing oversight, but it's particularly for the day-to-day experience of citizens and complaints and things that are not formal complaints, but things that need to be changed over a long period of time. I think there's plenty of opportunities to have more regular citizen oversight. That's our inclination.
I'd say you can also make the argument, and as a select board member, maybe I will, that we're pulled in all different directions as select board members and don't have the bandwidth to provide the attention necessary to provide the kind of oversight that you're talking about that, for instance, school committee members do specifically with one department, the schools. Okay. All righty then. Anything else for this subcommittee? And we have time, so feel free. Okay. We can come back if need be. The next one I have on our list is the Envisioning/Community Engagement Subcommittee. Would like to report out there.
Yeah, why don't I get started and then the other folks on the subcommittee can jump in. I will try to report back some of the things around which I think we have some emerging consensus as a subcommittee, and I think there's probably parts of this that are going to intersect heavily with what may be on the remainder of the agenda for this morning. So I think the first thing around which in our conversation we have some consensus is largely related to the survey, are continuing to use the survey, in that the survey as it's constructed right now is not necessarily going to be the thing that gives us the widest lens around what the possibilities for reimagining policing are going to be, or reimagining public safety are going to be. They're going to give us some important information about how residents of Brookline feel about the implementation of public safety, but it's not necessarily going to give us all the material that we need to reimagine what could be possible. The second thing around that for us that we discussed in our time was around sequencing. We briefly got to whether or not we feel like we needed to conduct the survey and use the results of that survey to then think about what we would do for community engagement work. And we decided no, that those things need to happen in parallel, that we need to do community engagement and outreach while we conduct the survey and not have one inform the other. The third is that we started to hatch out the beginnings of some plans for then how we would do that community outreach and engagement work. Of course, given the pandemic, of course, given what's happening right now with COVID-19, Zoom is always a possibility for being able to do some of that work. We talked together a bit about whether or not there were some alternatives that we might be able to pursue, largely for two reasons. One of them is that the medium of Zoom, this makes it and the topic of what we're talking about, those two things together may make for a suboptimal combination, that if it were possible for us to try to have something where we could do an in-person convening, that might give us the opportunity to get different and better information. While we were discussing that, there were some input from folks who were attendees, not the subcommittee, but attendees, that were a reminder that the content of this, what we're talking about, especially if we're talking from folks who have had a negative, suboptimal experience with police or public safety, that anonymity and the ability to share that story, sometimes often painful, that we have to be mindful of what is the right approach and the right venue for doing that. And finally, we also agreed that we don't have the full outline of a plan. Chi-Chi gave us, I think, some good caution that while we might have good networks that we can tap into to be able to start thinking about doing outreach to residents of the town, unless and until we have a strong plan in place, it's probably not going to be a good idea to go to those networks with ambiguity about what we might do. I agreed to take on some initial outreach to BHA, put out some feelers to folks over at BHA, got some calibrating guidance about who to talk to, but we don't yet have the bones of a plan if we decide we wanted to do both a Zoom-based and then an in-person, as safe as we can make it because of COVID-19 type of convening. So I'll let other folks jump in if there's things that I haven't given an accurate rundown on.
Others from the subcommittee who'd like to weigh in?
I would just add, I think Kristen did a really good job. It's just something for this own committee. Like, we're just really trying to be cautious around, is this a town reimagining or is it our reimagining? Thinking about the positionalities and identities we bring to this versus what speaks for the town at large. And just, and just on a personal note, trying to be cautious and honor that has also made it sometimes stagnating, right? Like you don't want to put something out there as if you're speaking for others, and then like at times I've been sort of stuck, like in terms of how to move forward and not speak for others and gain stuff. So it's good work. I'm not knocking it. I'm just trying to acknowledge one of the real complications. That as a task force, we're sort of asked to speak for Brookline at large. However, I don't feel like I personally represent Brookline at large. Like, it's up to me to kind of get that breadth, and that's a complicated thing to do.
Have you all thought about what, and it might be too early, but I'm thinking back from the final product, and are you envisioning in qualitative research, sometimes what we'll do is we use the conversations that we have to weave a narrative and include quotes from individuals as part of that narrative. Is that what you envision as, if it's not too early to tell what that might look like in our report, or might it be something else?
I don't feel like we've gotten the opportunity to wrestle with that together. In hearing you say that, Raul, I think part of what it raises for me is this question that we've been coming back to in the larger task force is the degree to which we feel like we don't have the data right now to be able to answer that type of question that you just posed. Because I've been to a number of hearings, forums, conversations with the select board where a number of the things that have been entered into the public record in the town, those types of narrative exist, but they're not in a form that allows us to pull them out easily and use them as part of this type of process. One, I think, would have to go back and either transcribe or re-listen to and try to get then documented some of the stuff that's already out there, that we would be asking again about some of those types of things, which I think is good to do. But I think also to Malcolm's.
I think you just muted yourself inadvertently. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm mindful of the boundaries of what we might consider doing as a subcommittee, in part because I think where I'm landing right now, and I'd certainly love to hear other subcommittees or the larger task force perspective, is that we probably can't make a decision about any re-envisioning. We can help the town do the work of getting that type of process underway with the residents of the town. Because if this were important for the town if the town valued doing it, it probably would have done it by now. So it is incumbent on us to try to give the town a way to do this process, but not try to do it for them.
On the topic of transcription and stories, I just wanted to note that there is a transcript from the September 26th joint hearing in the record. It's in the folder. Thanks to Devin and whoever else in the town that arranged for that. They actually had a court reporter transcribe that. So we do have some of the stories that were told orally at that hearing toward the end by people who did not submit written testimony. So that is in a usable form if we want to use it.
That's great. Thank you. And thanks to everybody who worked to make that happen. Appreciate that. Okay, great. For another question for the subcommittee, and others may have questions. Do you predict needing any support from the rest of the task force? And I'll just start by offering my support if you needed another set of ears to listen or to participate. And is that something that you think you might need going forward?
I think one of the things we talked about that the whole task force should be involved in is when the survey goes out, we had talked about outreach efforts to encourage folks to complete the survey, especially those who in BIPOC populations. And Kimberly had mentioned a meeting or so back, wanting to do outreach at BHA in particular, or that she felt the need for that. So that is something I think the entire committee could engage in, or task force.
Okay, great.
Raul, I might also add that I think there's going to be an increasing need, especially for this subcommittee, to pay attention to what is happening in the other subcommittees. We, for example, and I don't want to steal any thunder from Alexander, but some of the conversations that we were having in school resource officers is eventually coming back around to questions around if we're doing a good job with things like implementing or policing in schools, if people feel that way, whose voice gets to decide whether or not we're okay with where we are and what we should continue what we're doing. I would regard that as community engagement. And especially back to one of the themes that we're emerging is we're going to have to contend with this issue of if a large number of people, if a majority of people feel like I'm fine with the way this is, what is the critical mass then that is needed of folks to say, but I want us to consider something else? To me, that's a community engagement. It's just not SRO related. And we haven't come up with a way that we're going to try to figure out that theme as it relates to probably a number of topics. And so I think that is less than about a specific subcommittee's issue and more a larger task force or maybe a common theme across subcommittees.
Terrific. Any other questions here for this subcommittee before we move on to others? We do have time if you have questions. Okay.
I want to say that that last point is something I've been thinking a lot about in terms of who we are vis-a-vis the community and how to represent the differing opinions and also use those opinions to come up with our recommendations and next steps for reimagining, because we're going to get differing opinions. And it would be great to have some time in this meeting, not now and going forward, to really wrestle with that together and how to be inclusive and also make recommendations based on a town that's very divided.
And Eitan, please.
Yeah, I just want, so can I agree with everything Kristen said. And we had a conversation in the Department Analysis Subcommittee that I think also is a question for this subcommittee and all of our subcommittees, which is, Raul, I know your goal is to get us to a point where we're going to offer kind of clear recommendations. Is that right?
Say that one more time.
Your goal is for this task force to be able to essentially submit a clear set of recommendations.
Yeah, I do think, yeah. So we you're right. We did have this conversation in our departmental analysis subcommittee. Is we need the goal, the charge of this committee, of this task force, is to actually reimagine public safety and produce a set of recommendations that would, changes to public safety that would impact, of course, policing and ideally seek to solve some of the issues that brought us here in the first place, or at least mitigate some of those issues, or at least make less likely that the Black folks and other folks of color would have less negative impacts from policing. When I hear sort of give a town the way to do reimagining, I think there's an absolute benefit to that. And I think, our work also needs to produce recommendations. I think if we were to spend this time and then get to, let's say, February, or if we need more time, we can certainly ask for it, whenever the end of this, of our work is, and we produce a report that says, essentially, this is what the community feels about policing and public safety in Brookline, I think there's value to that, but I don't think that meets our charge. I think that meeting our charge means producing recommendations that for changes that other bodies can then deliberate on and ultimately vote on, including select board, town meeting, potentially school committee, or others. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. I guess my gut reaction, like where we are and how to get there, and I'd be curious for other folks to weigh in on this. I think there have been a number of kind of initial ideas that have risen up, right? I think about Malcolm's early suggestion. I'm sure there's continued work on this about, what kind of non-police after school community support for kids is happening, and how could we do that more? Or, you know, an idea of some kind of for citizen engagement in creating new ideas. We have, you know, maybe we'll have a dozen things like that. I would say it doesn't seem like right now, maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems like right now we're going to get hopefully a good report about how folks in the community from different parts of the community view policing. In other words, try to get a real handle on the scope of the problem and how it varies by, say, racial group within the town. And then we'll have like maybe 10 or 12 ideas, but they're going to be we're not like going for those ideas and trying to create some very clean set of proposals. Is that right? I mean, is that, do you think where we are?
I don't know. You know, so take traffic enforcement, for instance. I think there's a real opportunity there to reimagine a completely different way to do traffic enforcement that may at some levels include police, but perhaps at most levels might not. There are a couple of other municipalities pushing for this, Cambridge, just across the river, as well as Berkeley. And I think others are looking into it. This is something where we have a real opportunity to produce. And if you look at our charge, one of the things that it specifies is a completely different model of doing something. And so that's the difference between the important reform work that's happening with the other committee and Reimagining is it should be, I don't want to use the word radical, but it should be a deep departure from what we currently do. So imagining what it might look like to not have officers in schools, what it might look like to not have officers conduct traffic stops, which is one of the primary ways that members of the public are engaged by police. To imagine a scenario in which for issues related to mental health, that officers with guns are not the primary responders to those types of, like, to imagine what that might look like and to set forward different policy proposals. I do think we need to do that. If the question is how far are we away from that, I think we're still a distance from that. But maybe this is just the conversation we need to recenter on that work. Alexander, you want to weigh in? I know you had your hand up from before, but you might want to weigh in on this too.
My comment was for an earlier piece of this conversation. I love the conversation we're having now about reimagining more broadly. I just wanted to be an extra voice boosting. I think we as a task force need to spend a good bit of time talking about outreach and about what each of us intends to do in order to make that concrete. That's it.
Great, thank you. Mike, I see you.
Yeah, the comment about reimagining and reimagining in a way that departs significantly from what the police are doing now. I agree with you that that's very important to do. I think I think it's equally important not to assume that we're going to come up with something that's a very substantial difference is necessarily going to be the optimum choice or a better choice. It's important not to prejudge. And Raul, and you and I have exchanged some thoughts about traffic stops, and I think that's one of the areas that really needs to be looked at very carefully as to what the alternatives are. But I don't want to approach that from the perspective of, oh, I know that there's a better way. The question is, what can we think of that might be better, without making the assumption that what's being done now should be discarded.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important. You know, we're doing the work. We're getting the data about what the current state of affairs is. What I think we need to do, though, is not get caught in the let's start from where we are now and then see if we can make improvements to what's going on right now. Let us do the more imaginative work of saying, let's just imagine a world where police don't do traffic stops. Let's imagine a very different world. Let's start from there. And once we do the work to come up with some alternative version that may or may not need at some level to involve police, but probably not at the day-to-day level. Once we put that together, then let's compare it to what we currently do. Instead of just sort of doing that along the way every step. Let's completely just think from a new way. We're starting, you know, with Brookline, with the residents we have, with the crime rate we have, with all the things we have, imagining that we're starting from scratch here around traffic stops or around schools, things like that.
Right.
Might be one way to do it.
I agree that the best way to do what we're supposed to be doing is to start with a blank slate. I just want to make sure that we don't make the assumption that what we write on the blank slate is absolutely and inevitably going to be both different and superior. We have to,
right.
You know, we have to put something on the blank slate first and then make a judgment.
I think that's fair, and I don't think that we should be proposing anything unless ultimately at the end, unless we actually think it would be better.
Yeah.
And that's something that we'll all get to vote on. Everybody on the full task force. Kristen.
Yeah, I think that I'm coming from this from the perspective that we are sort of walking a line that I think says it hasn't gotten bad enough to look like this. It hasn't gotten bad enough to look like Walter Wallace. It hasn't gotten bad enough to look like what we see happening in other communities. And that isn't enough to me to say that we wouldn't go the direction that you're describing, which is to reimagine what it would look like to not have armed officers in schools. Only because we're going to have this conversation again if it does get bad enough. If there is an incident that causes us to then have something that resembles a community that we don't want to be thought of as resembling. And so I think it requires us then not to say we're somehow content because it's not bad enough yet, to get out ahead of saying, and it won't because we change the direction that we are going. And so I'm very mindful of, like, it feels crisis reactive to say that we would be, I don't know, I don't want us to be operating from a perspective that crisis would motivate us to do something, rather than saying this system as it's constructed is already demonstrated to lead to bad outcomes. And so why do we want to continue with a system that already leads to bad outcomes?
Well, crisis elsewhere is exactly what's convinced us that there can be bad, can be and have been bad outcomes. So it's already been demonstrated. Nobody has to prove that. But I think we also have to think about the complexity. Let's take the armed officers in schools. One of the things that one of the reasons that armed officers have been in schools in the recent past have been a different kind of tragedy altogether. The shootings in schools, shootings by nutcases that come into a school, and we're dealing with a public that is as conscious of that or more, than they are of any of the things that we're concerned about here. So I think we have to take it's if there were a simple solution to doing this, to reimagining and reallocating resources, I think we would have come up with it. It's complicated. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. That doesn't mean it can't be done. I'm not saying any of that. I wouldn't be here if I felt that way. But I do think we have to think all of the pieces that enter into the puzzle when we come up with a concept that differs from what we're doing now.
All right, let's get Ann in here, and then I'm mindful that we still need to hear from 3 of our other subcommittees, and the very next one is schools, so we can have more of that conversation. Ann, please.
I really just want to say I appreciate this conversation tremendously, and I've missed having this conversation over the last few weeks with the full group, because I've been noticing in the subcommittees that I'm part of, and also in other subcommittees that I've been observing, as well as vis-a-vis the Reform Committee and the town at large. People, even within this task force, have very, very different perceptions of maybe what they think would be the ideal way forward, and that it's helpful to me to hear again the charge of this committee, that we are here to be bold and to really reimagine what we could present as a different way of serving people in this community that is radically different from what we have now. Again, based on research, based on what we're hearing from community members. So I just want to push back a little on with Mike in terms of, yes, we're going to be offering recommendations that are very different, likely very different from what we currently have in Brookline. But that doesn't mean that they're so radical that they're just off the table, that they're based on solid research, that they're based on community participation, and that this hasn't come around just because of recent crises in the United States and or elsewhere around policing, but obviously those factors may have helped create this committee in terms of having the select board sign on saying this is a worthwhile, research and that needs to be done, but that this has been happening for ever in our towns and only recently has been getting the attention because of national events that have resulted in major tragedy. But those tragedies were happening anyway. The media has just only recently really helped, publicize it and make the public more aware of it. But I really appreciate this conversation because I think it's just important to keep coming back to as we're doing our work, because we're going to be hearing from all sorts of different perspectives, but to keep the framework in mind of what the charge is for us as a task force in terms of our recommendations is just really helpful to hear as we move forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Ann. One of the things I'll say too is if folks thought that this was going to end up being a task force filled with a bunch of nut jobs, I think if they've been following our work, sorry about that with the language, if they've been following our work, then they are sorely mistaken. This is work that if people are listening in from one week to the next, see that it is grounded in, we're having how many conversations, every single conversation about making sure that this is grounded in community needs and that we're doing everything we can, lifting, everything we can to make sure that ultimately when we do produce recommendations, they actually work for the people who are here to work for, but also that ultimately they need to be ratified by this group of professionals with expertise in any variety of fields here, who are really serious about this work. And so, I'm fully confident that whatever we end up putting forward is something that's serious, that we believe is workable, that we believe will be beneficial to the communities that brought us here in the first place, and that we believe deserve consideration, meaningful consideration by others. I'm one of those folks that likes the word radical. It doesn't mean wacky. It doesn't mean sort of unworkable. It doesn't mean whatever other folks think it means. It means, in the classic sense, a radical departure from what we currently do. So if folks want to use a different word, they can say a meaningful departure from what we currently do, or find whatever word works for you. But I think it's going to be really important that our work is both radical and grounded at the same time, and it can be both. All right, I want to make sure we have time for our other subcommittees. So school resource officers is next.
Who wants to talk about what we've done?
I don't mind starting, even though I came late to the last meeting. We spent a lot of time talking about, not just what is the role, but what precipitated actually having school resource officers in our school. Like what was the origins of that, and trying to find a history trail for that that's documented. And so, like, while we have the most recent memorandum of agreement or of understanding that was signed, less than a calendar year ago. So, which is it was signed in 2019. So, what precipitated all that before is still really unclear for us. And so we've been trying to answer that question. And then really trying to figure out the distinct roles of what it means in elementary schools. There's a police officer stationed at the high school. That's not true at the elementary schools, but there's still an involvement. It's not fully clear what that is and what that means. And and so less from the group, more for me. I mean, I've tried to reach out to other people. Brookline doesn't have a perfect mirror in terms of a town, but talking to people who are in similar towns, even talked to a friend who's on the Evanston, Illinois school board about their role with their resource officers, some other things, just to get a sense of what that can mean, and what districts that are similar, or cities that are similar, or municipalities that are similar, what their roles of their school resource officers are. Yes, I think I'll shut up now.
Others from the subcommittee?
Yeah, I think Malcolm is right on, and I think we in the time that we've had together to discuss, I think we are relatively a bit gingerly, I would say, getting into the degree to which the presence of a critical mass of Black and brown bodies is entangled with where we end up with more pronounced deployments of folks for policing. The degree to which there is some entanglement of race and racism with where we end up choosing, not that we're saying that it is specifically an intent, but there's an entanglement of those sets of issues that we need to be able to talk through, because I think it is among the perceptions that folks have. I think Kimberly has been very good about keeping that front and center on the table as we're having this discussion, that we can't disentangle these issues. It's important that when we look at it from how was it perceived and experienced, regardless of what the MOUs were, regardless of what the intent is how is it perceived and experienced.
One of the questions that I hope I don't know if you might not be there yet, but and I need to take a deeper look at this MOU as well. But in terms of the purpose of school resource officers, one of the questions I have is just came up earlier. Is it about school safety, and if so, from whom? Are school resource officers there to protect against, some of the tragedies that we've seen at schools around the country? Is that why they're there? Are they there for some other safety reasons that are independent of sort of active shooter situations and those kinds of things? Or are they there for some other reason? Is there some other reason outside of that if those were not concerns that officers would be in schools? This is one for me where it's not obvious to me that officers should be in schools. It seems that if you wanted to, you could park someone in a cruiser outside of a school if it was about the first thing that I mentioned, the sort of school shooter thing. I think this is one where we need to sort of dig a little bit and again, even perhaps get folks that are on the school side, not just on the police department side, but folks on the school side to really think about what their motives are in having police in schools. I don't know if you're just sort of breaching the surface here or you're anywhere down that line. But anyway, those are some of the questions that I have that hopefully we can get answers to.
I mean, Raw, I think. Go ahead, Alexander. Go ahead.
Along those lines, and I'm just floating this here now because I'm curious about whether it's something we could ask. I think, in our next SRO community, we could talk about whether this is something we want to actually make a request of. To what extent can we sort of ask Michael Downey for legal answers? Because what we're digging into, we have been digging into that and asking that question, I would say, at least in preliminary stages of why we have this type of setup. And we were kind of poking around at the statute that requires there to be an SRO officer. And again, I'll bring this up in the next subcommittee. We don't have to talk about it now, but I would love to know, what are the minimum statutory requirements? What would we need to do in order to be fulfilling that statute? And maybe while still changing or reimagining the role of the SRO officer, if that's what we feel we should do.
And just to that, I think Raul had mentioned earlier, using the whole, the whole committee as a resource for different subcommittees. I know that I'm not obviously a voting member of the full committee or any of the subcommittees, but I'm happy to serve as a resource as well for any questions that subcommittees or the full committee has. And so, I don't have that answer off the top of my head, but I'm fully willing and to help out as possible. And if that question does come up during a subcommittee meeting, I can respond to it accordingly. And so I can look into that if you'd like, and you can let me know like when a subcommittee meeting is taking place, and I can jump in on that meeting and kind of provide that answer. So let me know, I guess, how you want to do it, and I can look into that and get a response for you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I haven't discussed this with the rest of the SRO committee yet, so I think that's why I was trying to be like, obviously I haven't talked about this with the committee, so I think we'll talk about that on our meeting on Monday. And if that's something we'd like you to dig into, we could let you know at that point. Would that work for you?
Yes, of course. And that goes for the rest of the subcommittees as well. I'm happy to serve as a resource as much as I can.
And also just a reminder that if it's helpful to you as a subcommittee, you can also collaborate using a Google Doc, which you will have the access to edit and the public will have the access to view if you wanted to work through and come up with a list of questions for Michael. Or alternatively, you can just send him a list of questions if you have them as a result of a meeting or something like that. But if it's something where you feel like, in between meetings, you want to work on, generating questions for Michael, that's another way that you can do it. All right. Malcolm, you had unmuted before.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, Raul, that at least that's what your comment to me is around sort of the historical foundation for me. And so, and I don't know that there's an actual narrative over there. I feel personally, as a historian, I'm doing something to my training where I look at different pieces and factors and try to put together a narrative. And it's different because it's more supposition. There are some parties and people I could reach to. Like I could call Bob Weintraub, who was a headmaster for almost 20 years. I could reach to him and he would tell me his version of that narrative. But one of the things I pushed in that SRO committee meeting last Monday was, to me, it also seems, when we got the police officer station at Brookline High School, that was the same time you had a young new superintendent who was mostly based in Boston, where there's a much larger presence of police officers in schools. And so I'm curious if that just felt normal to him to put something in place. And now he's somebody I can't actually reach to. I mean, I could cold reach to him, right? He was here for 4 years. Would he remember me? Do we, what I mean? Like, I didn't know him super well, right? Like, and so I don't know if he'd even respond. But like, sometimes it seems to fit a more national narrative, right? Like when this was happening nationwide, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s, that was referred to. And some of it does fit sort of a post-11, post Columbine, kind of school thing. And then other times it's a little unclear. And so, and the document trail is unclear. And so, like when I asked the headmaster, Alex had thought this and I thought it too, he didn't really have knowledge of prior MOUs, right? And even where to find them. And he's a fairly new headmaster. So again, I can reach to Weintraub, but I don't know there's an actual paper trail where, like my history training, I could actually look at and examine what's in there. And I'm going to search for it on both sides, school side and police side. But that does leave us in this sort of funky predicament of, again, not being able to use document to flesh a narrative. It's going to be based on a lot of them.
Right.
Yeah,
I think it's important too to bring in a number of perspectives, right? So bringing in perspective of current and former, heads of school is important, but also bringing perspective of the folks from those programs that, nearby where the SRO is currently situated, I think will be equally as important, maybe even more important to understand because, they're the ones potentially, being impacted in that way, as well as this may go out without saying, but folks will say I didn't say it, is because I think we've talked about it before, is talking to the actual current SRO at Brookline High and getting her perspective on all of this too, of course. Mike, were you going to jump in?
I was going to say Bob Weintraub would be a good resource for getting a historical perspective, and I'm sure Malcolm, he'd be happy to talk to you. He's very much engaged in Brookline affairs still, and I'm sure he'd be really interested.
Other questions for this subcommittee or thoughts? Okay, we can circle back. Next up, what's my place here? Next up, we have vulnerable people and people in crisis. Struggle with that first word, vulnerable. There we go.
So I can get started, and Alex and Anne can jump in. We've been continuing to meet weekly on Thursdays, and also sort of starting to work on our preliminary report recommendations. The Google Docs thing is working out really beautifully for us, just to, where it's only edited by us and no one else. And so we continue to do that. We also, so yesterday we interviewed Annabelle Lane and her supervisor, Jen Pastor, about the role of the crisis intervention team. And we had some people from the public also join, as well as Chief O'Leary. And Bonnie came for a little bit at the end as well. So really, and again, we were able to generate questions on the Google Doc. So that was also really good. We had a number of questions. We didn't get through them all. I think we met with them for a little bit over an hour. And they were really great and agreed to come back, because again, we basically just got, we didn't get to delve into like some of the very specific questions. We sort of ended up having like an overall view of the crisis intervention team, how it works, the history of it, some of the training that's done by the officers, what are the gaps and that Annabelle talked about, because we wanted to hear like what works really well, what doesn't work, what do you think, and getting kind of ideas from them about that. And again, we haven't debriefed on this whole conversation, but it'll be in the minutes that Alex is going to put together. So I don't know how much detail to go into, but one of the interesting things to me was that Annabelle doesn't get, she's paid by a DMH, Department of Mental Health grant, and not by the Brookline Police Department. So that was kind of interesting, because I had no idea about that. And her role is really to do a lot of regional training as well. And so it's not like she's solely devoted to the police. It's like, that's part of her job, but then she's all this other stuff too. And, so we kind of talked about that. It's like, yeah, there's no sole person really devoted as a social worker to the police department. That kind of stood out for me, and Alex and Anne can jump in. One of the people from people from the public, Ryan Black, also asked an interesting question, like, why is this embedded? Why is CIT embedded within the police department? Like, what's the reason? And so we talked about that. And again, if there if people have questions, we can go into more details. We also talked about their connection with the Brookline Mental Health Center, as well as the Boston Emergency Services team, I think, which is actually also serves Brookline. So we spoke about those things. And then again, please, Alex and Anne, jump in. These are the highlights, but again, I don't know how much detail to go into for this meeting. So again, if there are questions, we can certainly entertain them.
That's helpful. Anne, I see you.
So we had a good conversation last night, learning more about the CIT program and the role that the Brookline Police Department has right now in terms of serving community members in crisis. Next week, we're going to speak with Ian Lang, who is the Executive Director of the Brookline Community Center for Mental Health. I always get the words mixed up, but that's, I think, the right way of saying it. And also, we discussed at the end of our meeting last night that it would be good to also, perhaps especially with the Brookline Center and maybe some other places that do work in our community, hear from people on the ground. With Ian Lang, we'll get a really good overview of all of the different community services that the Brookline Center right now serves and supports, but also to try to connect with somebody from the Brookline Center who's actually on the ground doing the work, as to what it looks like from that perspective. So we're in the process of just gathering information, stakeholders in the community, and as well as all three of us have contributed a lot of articles, webinars, to share with each other about work that is going on locally and around the country and other places around this issue. So we've been having that discussion and trying to kind of suss out what's out there, what happens that goes along with a police department also providing these services, what happens without any police involvement in community crisis types of situations, and kind of wrestling with with that in terms of what we're going to be recommending for the town. One thing that I wanted to ask that I didn't ask last night on the call that I thought about afterwards, in terms of the fact that Annabelle Lane is being, her job is funded through DMH, is I wanted to find out more information about that funding. How much funding does DMH provide, like specifically right now, to the police to provide these services, in terms of what we could reimagine that funding source being for crisis services and supports outside of the police department. More specifics about the funding sources and what kind of amount we're talking about, and in terms of our recommendations for the future. Because I never really thought about DMH as a funding resource, but it's obvious that it's a huge one. That maybe we could, you know, as a town, potentially, if we're recommending something outside of the police to serve people in our community, we could press for DMH to give us that funding source to be used in a different way.
Dan, is that something, or I'm just going to go ahead and ask, can you track down that information for us in terms of the amount and any other funding from DMH?
I can track that. I will. But one thing we should understand is that the ability for us to attain that grant funding, which was about 3 or 4 years ago, was hinged on the fact that the police department became a training center for other departments, not just in Norfolk County, but around the area as well. So that's how we got the funding. We trained just about all of our officers under this funding. But the bottom line is we have to be the training center. We have to have our officers committed to going out and training the other departments. Matter of fact, they just finished the training in Walpole last week. But so I know that's the connection. We had to agree to do that in order to get the funding. The funding supported doing that. But I can find out, because I know when I left, we're in the first year of a, hopefully would have been a 5-year grant. I'll find out what's remaining in the figures for you.
Thank you. Alexander, do you have anything to add to?
Yes, and this is just briefly because Anne and Alice have covered this really well. One thing that was really interesting, just particularly in our conversation with Annabelle, was she and the CIT officers are in a unique position of often wanting to refer people to outside services so they know what they most frequently are going, I really wish this existed. So she had some great ideas actually about things that could change, new things that we could set up that might be really useful for Brookline residents. And so expect more from our committee about that when we've had more time to discuss it.
And I think one of the, sorry, go ahead.
No, you first, Amos.
No, I was just going to say that one of the questions we had too, Raul, for you is the preliminary report that's due for us November 13th. Like, we wanted to get a better idea of what that will entail. Is it sort of like the process and what we've done so far, or is it actually recommendations? Like, what are the expectations? And I maybe other people on the committee task force also have similar questions, but just so that when we start working on it, we know what your expectations are for that report.
Okay. Yeah,
Yes.
I think
we're confused. We want, if we could make it sort of a brief overview of what we've done so far and what we think are next steps in terms of our subcommittee work moving forward, that would be ideal. But if you're expecting more, we definitely like to hear from you about.
I would say, you know, and you tell me how much time you need, but I think it's important to lay out a few things. One is here's what we've done so far, right? So everything that would be in the minutes without folks having to go back to all the minutes and say, here's you know, the folks that we've talked to, the programs we've looked into, et cetera. Here's what we think we know right now, based on our research, including all those conversations. Here are the questions that we still have that are unresolved, and that we need more time to be able to work through. And if you have any recommendations at that moment, I don't know that you will by November 13th, looking at being October 30th and hearing where we are right now. I doubt it, but if you did, I'd love to hear those at that point too in that preliminary report. But it seems like that is that reasonable?
Yeah.
Okay. The question when, you know, I think, again, I'm just trying to get down to these like central questions about this work. You know, I will say for our current approach, right? For the approach that we have right now, which is generally the approach that others use too, with situations. I was thinking about the situation with Walter Wallace Jr. in Philadelphia just this past week. The police response to that and a real sort of policing first strategy around that. I will say, you know, there are departments around the country that wish they had close to 100% of their officers trained in CIT. And that's something that we are routinely at 100 or right before 100 when we bring on new recruits and stuff like that. I guess it seems to me that the work in terms of reimagining this is the essential question is there a better solution where armed officers become the backup, secondary responders? I don't know. I don't know that if there is. This is I say that openly. I don't know. But I think one of the things that I'd like to see if this subcommittee can help us answer. There's some examples we know of other programs in other places in the country. Are those workable? Is that something that could work here? You know, I don't imagine a situation where someone has any kind of weapon, we would send a social worker and only a social worker. But I think that I don't personally imagine that, but maybe you might. My question though is who's engaging with that person and how, and are there better ways to de-escalate situations than even having officers CIT trained with all the background and all that kind of stuff? Is there a better and even safer way to de-escalate those situations? I'd like to see if we can get some answers to that or some recommendations there. If that makes sense. Mike, I saw you had your hand up before. I don't hear you, but I think you're on mute.
Sorry. No, I'm okay, but I do want to respond to the question about sending an armed officer versus someone else. Certainly, when somebody doesn't have a weapon, and one thing is you don't know whether somebody has a concealed weapon or not, so that's always a difficult question. But I've seen officers, MBTA transit officers, do something in an MBTA station that I thought was just awful, with a guy who was clearly having a mental problem, and they basically wrestled him to the ground for no damn reason. And I was thinking, and I knew about the Brookline police program at that point. I was wishing that there was a Brookline officer there to tell them how to respond a little bit more sensibly. So you're right. We're fortunate to have that. The question that you're asking is, what's a step beyond that? And I think it's important to recognize that as good as the training may be, there may be a step beyond it. Yeah, let's look and see what else is out there. And for that matter, let's talk to police officers, if we, particularly the people who are doing the training, to get a sense from them as to what they think might improve the situation.
We did last night.
You did?
Yes.
And how did that? What was the response? How did that? What did you get back?
Well, I mean, we talked about this a little earlier today in this meeting, but we interviewed Jen Pastor and Annabelle Lane last night for
Yes,
an hour.
Yes, but
Sorry.
go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
sorry, Ed, go ahead. I just want to add on to that.
And we tried to frame the discussion around, okay, this is happening now. You have the CIT trained officers. We have Annabelle Lane. You guys are going out and serving this need in the community. What do you think is missing? What do you think would be helpful? What if we didn't have police officers doing this role? What do you think we should have in Brookline to better serve vulnerable people, so that crisis situations happen less frequently, so that police officers are not the first people to be called in such a crisis? And so we did have this conversation last night, and it was very helpful. Go ahead, Alexander.
So, I mean, I want to respectfully disagree with that characterization. We mostly heard from Annabelle Lane along those questions. We did ask those questions. We were mostly, so Lieutenant Pastor was there, and she largely gave us an understanding of the background for the CIT program. She answered a couple of other questions. But in terms of what we think specifically police officers, specifically police officers think they could be doing better, or we could be doing better as a community, that particular question didn't get posed in that way.
Okay. I think of Annabelle Lane as part of the police department, which is where I'm coming from.
Sure, she's not an officer.
Right, she's not an officer,
Yeah.
but she's working with them and going out on calls with them. And sorry, that's.
I'm just wondering if maybe behooves us to perhaps do some interview with, like, the police. Might want to think about that, and make that one of our interviews just to get their perspective about it. So instead of just Annabelle's, so maybe we can talk about that internally.
I think the advantage of doing that is, first of all, I think you'll get we'll get some ideas back. But the other thing that we'll get back is the officer's perspective. And that's very valuable, because in order to understand the world as we see it, we have to sometimes be able to look through their eyes. Whether we come up with a different solution or not is really beside the point. But we need to be able to see through their eyes what they see, and perhaps we'll say, no, that's not quite right. You're looking at it the wrong way. But let's find out what they do see.
Yeah, we've heard, I've certainly heard from folks, I've heard this over and over before. I don't know if the belief is the same within our department, but that officers have been asked to do more and more and more, and basically in being asked to be social workers, essentially being asked to, and whether or not that's something, I don't know that frankly, I don't know that our department gets to weigh in on whether or not they want that to be their job. The community decides what we need and who's best suited for that is I think the right approach. However, I think it'd be helpful to hear what some of the pain points are there, and whether or not officers feel like that is consistent with the other tasks that they have on their plate. The other thing I'd like for us to see if this subcommittee can help us do is tease out, because we're using, and I know that this was something that came up in the public hearing, so separate from the conversation we're just having, but around domestic violence, this big broad term for domestic violence, which captures someone beating on their spouse, but also seems to capture an argument between maybe two brothers in their apartment or something like that. It seems to capture this broad range of incidents, and which are different, certainly different in nature, including potentially, I don't know if and maybe the chief, I don't know if we need to weigh in right now, but I just want to throw this out there, is some of these are calls about, what is an argument, and others are calls about physical violence. And these are two very, if at least from my understanding, these are two very different things. And I'm wondering if we need to tease out a little bit more what the appropriate response for those different types of incidents that might fall within this big umbrella that we all just sort of colloquially call domestic violence, but folks that are part of the domestic violence roundtable which is in Brookline, are very concerned, and I think with a very specific type or specific types maybe of domestic violence. I know there was a lot of words, but I hope that you get my meaning of trying to understand, for instance, the data, especially around the number of the different types of domestic violence calls and what that looks like. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. One thing I just wanted to say quickly in response to the discussion about police officers and their roles as CIT, social worker type roles, is one thing Annabelle said last night that really stayed with me was, when a police officer is going out who's CIT trained to work with somebody in the community who's in crisis, part of the entire perspective and approach around CIT, which is similar to other kind of harm reduction, trauma-informed mental health crisis philosophies, is the fact that you stay with that person for a long, sometimes it means staying with that person for a long period of time, in order to support them without it escalating into a situation where next steps of like going to an ED for a mental status evaluation happen. That sometimes if you just stay there and support the person, those types of situations can be de-escalated to a point where nothing else needs to happen. And Annabelle spoke briefly last night about the struggle for police officers in that role, because they are always listening for the next call that might come in terms of the next emergency or police that they need to go somewhere else, and the struggle between them being in that role of supporting somebody, and it might take a few hours as opposed to being ready for the next call out in the field. So that really resonated with me in terms of what a police officer who's trained in that approach might be struggling with. In terms of DV, I just wanted to mention that Almaz and Alexander and I did join a DV roundtable discussion a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember if we talked about this already. Have we met as a—
Not here, or we haven't talked about it.
Okay. We joined one of their meetings probably 2 weeks ago, and we are going to set up a meeting with one of the folks in that roundtable, Julie, I can't remember her last name. We decided that we wanted to prioritize stakeholders who were directly involved with the crisis, going out and meeting somebody in crisis in the community first. But we definitely have Julie tabled for an interview with her probably in the next month or so, maybe after our report. And also, Dan, if there's any way we could get that data about what Raul is referring to, of how many DV BPD calls are based on a like spouse kind of domestic violence situation vis-a-vis,
or child abuse, or whatever else.
Altercation. Yeah, that would be, I mean, I don't know if you could get that for us, but that would be really helpful.
I will try, yes. If I could just,
Please go ahead, Dan.
I just wanted to say a little bit about what Mike had talked about with the CIT and what happened with the T, and you asked what more can be done. I think if you take a look at the change that we made in the use of force policy, that emphasizes de-escalation, as long as you have the opportunity to do that, and you train your department not only in CIT, but also the use of force policy, and you constantly reinforce that type of training. That's when you get to a situation where you're going to hopefully have less of a violent outcome, and you're going to be able to work through things. And I think that's a good thing of what Brookline does. And then a little bit about Ian, I kind of had a different takeaway from that conversation in that I know Annabelle's talked about being rushed through the calls and all that, but the big thing about CIT and de-escalation is to provide time. And I think towards the end of her conversation, she said that Brookline does allow their officers that are on those calls the time to work their way through that. And I took that as a positive.
No, absolutely. But time is a relative thing. And just from my personal experience in that role, it can literally take hours and hours. So what that struggle is for somebody who's trained as a police officer, who's there to potentially provide other services as well, while literally just sitting next to somebody for a very long period of time. That's just a struggle that I wanted to note moving forward. And we absolutely, let's interview somebody in the police force who is trained in CIT and get their perspective as well.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to send you a newspaper article at the end of this, came out this week from the Washington Post on a study that was done on the type of use of force training that we do. I'll send it to you when we get off the Zoom.
If you
share.
can send that to Devin so that she can forward it on to everybody, that'd be helpful.
Yes. Okay.
I want to bring Alexandra in, and then I need to preserve time for the walk and talk subcommittee. Go for it.
So I want to say just two things about the briefly about the domestic violence conversation. One is that I want to kind of trouble a little bit like the what you were bringing up, Raul. I don't think there's nearly as clean a division between a domestic violence incident that does and doesn't involve physical violence. Because of the nature of these situations and how fluid they are. And this gets into some philosophical discussions about what violence is, right? But you can have a circumstance where somebody has been throwing things around the house and has punched a wall and done a bunch of things that are physically threatening and hasn't physically harmed anybody in that moment, but is nevertheless part of a pattern of power and violence. And so like, I just want to like briefly say that these situations are way more complicated than can be easily or briefly discussed in a public meeting. Second piece I want to say is I've brought this up in committee meetings a number of times, but I'll just say it here briefly. It's not clear to me that it's terribly proper or maybe useful for our committee to be handling domestic violence. And I recognize I'm in the minority on this, but I just want to float it before the full task force, as long as we're talking about it. To me, what's useful about our subcommittee is that we can address, I recognize, as somebody coming from the public defense perspective, my positions on like, I think police should be much less involved in virtually everything is the fairly radical position that many people don't share. I think a lot of people share the position that police involvement is not necessary or helpful in situations where a person is experiencing mental health crisis, where a person is experiencing homelessness, where a person is experiencing substance abuse issues, that these are not things particularly that police bring this into the criminal legal system, which is utterly unequipped to handle these problems and which don't solve them in any way. And I think an awful lot of people feel that that in at least some circumstances, police involvement in domestic violence situations is an appropriate use of the criminal legal system. And so I think that this particular area is much more fraught than the other pieces. And this is something that we heard in the public meeting a few weeks going back. It's not to say that we can't like have good and powerful conversations about how to think about the ways that in which police interact with folks when they're out on a domestic violence call, but I think it's a lot less clear, and in some ways that the emotions that people bring to this particular topic are running really high.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's for me it speaks to and again, this is my current view on it, but your work might actually, could change my view on this, but speaks to the, the differentiation, I think, is about who the first responder is, right? It seems clear that if someone with an advantage over someone else was literally on top of that person, harming them, that we would want someone with the physical ability and ability to save that person. I mean, and to the skills to do that kind of thing physically. I don't know how many of those are circumstances versus something else where maybe what we need is someone that can simply, using talk, separate parties and reach some kind of, help reach some kind of resolution. I just don't know, but that's why the work that you're doing and Ann and Amos is so important. Go ahead.
Sorry, really briefly, I know we need to move on. In terms of like a person on top of another person, I think this is something that criminal defense attorneys talk about a lot in terms of police. And I may receive some pushback here from Chief O'Leary, but in many circumstances, what you find is that the police get there after whatever's happened has already happened.
Right.
When the police are getting there in time to intervene in some situation that is in any way turned physical, fine. Often they're showing up afterwards and are bringing these folks into the criminal legal system and doing investigation and figuring out what happened and gathering evidence. So I think that's in some ways a popular misconception in terms of the proportion of times
That's the rare
that occurs.
circumstance you're saying, yeah.
Well, rarer, I think, than we might often think.
All right, great. Well, thanks. I've got to move on just because I'm sorry, but just because we have other work to do and we have to hear from the other subcommittee. But please keep doing this work. Inform me. This is not an area where certainly I'm deeply informed. So I'm going to rely on you all to do the work and help inform us all about this. So thank you. Is that okay? All right. I do want to hear from now our final subcommittee, which is the walk and talk unit. Make sure that they have ample time.
Hey y'all, I'm struggling a little bit this morning, so I'm gonna start this report and hope that Ann and Kimberly can jump in with some support if I'm a little patchy. So our subcommittee is very, very much parallel to the school resource officer subcommittee. We are wrestling with pretty much the same exact questions around why does it exist? What's its history? How did it start? Is there a contract? Are there written objectives for this? And none of those things are easily able to be dug up. There's a MOU that exists that we haven't seen yet. But as far as working out the reasons for why walk and talk exists, there's not a law that says there needs to be a specific police force paying specific attention to housing authority in Massachusetts. So why is there dedicated officers there? Why does my neighborhood not have dedicated officers? And we got the opportunity to ask Sergeant Hatchett many questions around these things because she was in attendance in one of our meetings. So we got some good perspective from that angle of it, around, you know, the good work that they do, the intentions that they have. But we also found that within, you know, the 30 years that Brookline Walk and Talk program has been in existence, there has never been an assessment of the program from the perspective of the community. Like, what does the community feel the Walk and Talk program does for them? Does it, you know, do they feel safe? Do they feel intimidated? Do they feel okay having, you know, knowing that there's dedicated officers for their property and feel that there's a reason to do that? Do they feel like, you know, so in 30 years, if those questions haven't been asked to the public, that seems central to our work here, to make sure we understand, you know, the intention, but most essential, the impact of what that is. I'm sure, you know, we have certainly heard from Walk and Talk fans in, you know, whenever we're asked, people show up speaking of all the, you know, the many good things that are happening, but I'm not going to remember the exact question that I think Raul, you were talking about it, that while it's clear that the police department is very passionate about this work and very enthusiastic about this work, it is not the police department that decides how these objectives, if there are objectives in BHA or needs that need to be met. The police department does not, isn't in the spot to decide that the police department is the one to address those needs. So we have to, you know, while there's enthusiasm and all that from the police department side, and there are people that very much benefit from it, we have to look at it in a broader, with a broader lens to that. So the future of what we're thinking obviously has a whole lot of information gathering that has to happen from us. Working out a plan to be able to speak with BHA residents, interviews, maybe written communications, digging through public statements, or anyone who's willing to make a new public statement is essential. Speaking with heads of BHA on the history. There is a brand new head of the BHA now, so perhaps the person in that position previous to him would probably be a good idea to speak with. What else? Oh, and so I think we might be the only subcommittee that has it has a mirror in the reform task force. So now that we are in this place with our questions and our direction kind of nailed down, we have developed a series of, you know, a draft of interview questions that we would like to be able to ask people. Now it might be a great time to, and we haven't talked extensively about this in our subcommittee, but now would probably be a good time to inquire within ourselves and with the Reform Walk and Talk subcommittee to look at the questions that we are trying to ask the BHA residents, because I'm sure there's a ton of overlap here. We might have a different angle. I mean, we certainly have a different angle. Our objectives are different, but working together, or at least making sure we're very aware of the process that both subcommittees are taking is pretty important in our specific subcommittee. Do you guys have more to add to that?
I think you summed it up really, really well. We are in the process of writing a flyer that we want to get out ASAP to invite BHA residents to meet with us, likely on a one-on-one basis, so for anonymity purposes, and have a set of questions that we're asking every single person. So we're working with the same set of questions and just get their answers to and transcribe, hopefully get permission to record them and transcribe their answers, and share with our subcommittee members in terms of hearing other perspectives from residents at BHA about walk and talk. Anything that we can, any information we can get from the other walk and talk committee in the police reform committee would be incredibly helpful for us in terms of moving forward with our interview questions and with our, considerations in terms of our recommendations and just our strategy moving forward. And we were also wondering if we could have an extension in terms of our initial report, because of these concerns, because we haven't been able to actually interview BHA residents yet about their perspectives on walk and talk. We've heard a good amount about the walk and talk program from Casey and Dan O'Leary, and sort of the police perspective. But we really would like to be able to get at least some interviews done with residents before even writing a preliminary report.
Well, let's do this. I'd like it if you can, just as we mentioned with the other subcommittee, if there can be at least something written down about, here's what we've done. Here are, here's what we know so far. Here's whatever data we have, and here's our plan moving forward, and questions that are still outstanding. I think that would still be helpful to have on let's say November 13th.
We can do that.
Yeah, 13th is better than the 6th. So
yeah, do 13th. Yeah. That'll be our big day.
Yeah. So something I would like to bring up that I think I'm sure we're all dealing with, but particularly this subcommittee and the Envisioning Community Engagement Subcommittee is that there is an education element that we have to overcome before we can get to the information that we need. And we're struggling with that in this group ourselves. The people doing this work are also struggling with trying to grasp the root idea of the goals here about reimagining. And this is not a criticism. This is the work that we're doing. It's a hard shift to put our minds into. So as we're trying to progress this work forward, we are gathering information about people's experiences, but we're also trying to seed people's imagination, people's thought process, to be able to gather their perspective on what might be a new angle, because as Malcolm was saying earlier, it's not on us to represent the town to say what's best and what could be imagined. So this is, it needs to be said that there's I don't know, both coming to a strong understanding ourselves as the people doing this work, and then also communicating that out. I use the word education. I'm a little uncomfortable with that word, but being able to communicate the work that we're trying to do, and then gather the information. Like that's the steps that need to be taken, and that is a large time suck in results, in actually achieving results. And I was in and out earlier this morning when we were talking about that in the community engagement subcommittee, but that's one of the reasons why we're trying to have some kind of event, whether it's a Zoom event or an in-person event, to be able to, rather than hand out a document, I believe this is a conversation. It's very nuanced. It's not like, clearly, because we have this written out, we have our charge written out, and still we are all struggling with this. So it's more than just a few sentences encapsulating it. It's a conversation and an interaction.
What I would say is keep working the problem the best way you know how. I am mindful that that we're on a tight timeline.
Mm-hmm.
I think that. So there's a couple things here, and maybe this is a conversation. Maybe we should check in December and see where we are in December. But you've all committed to do this work up until February. I'm not going anywhere. If there's work that needs to continue and others are willing to do it beyond February, then that's terrific. I just think that's a conversation we need to have as a task force and maybe even as subcommittees, and see if folks are not just willing, but also able to continue on beyond February.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to try to keep us to the timeline we're on to the extent possible, with the understanding that as you do this work, you realize, look, we've still got to lay the groundwork to even get to the place where we could be getting answers to these questions. I fully understand. So let's just keep touching base about that. But I would say do the work in the way that's necessary to do it, that you feel is necessary. And if it ends up taking longer, then we'll have to figure out what that looks like.
Right. Well, and that wasn't even an argument for pushing off deadlines. That's just acknowledging that, perhaps all of our subcommittees are in this spot. And I don't know if there's a way that we can align ourselves with how we speak about this to the public. How do we align ourselves so that we are well communicating the idea of reimagining and not miscommunicating it? Just a thought. But if there's any more about walk and talk, I'm happy to. We didn't ask for any questions. If anyone has questions, please ask.
Well, let me just say, I'll start off by just saying there are a couple of things that I wrote down is, and I think maybe you can get us answers to this by that November 13th is
Mm-hmm.
why does if they still agree, why does the police department think that this is an important program, and what are the aims of their view of the aims of the program? Why does BHA, if the BHA leadership, and I'm not talking about folks who live in BHA private, but the folks who are contracting with the police department to have this program, why do they think it's important?
Yes.
And what are their aims? Do they view, either one of them, do they view this as a benefit, like a bonus? And if so, to whom is it a benefit? Or is this providing extra protection? If so, from whom is it providing protection? So those are the kinds of questions that I have around this. I think the other things to recognize is that Brookline's not a monolith, and neither are the folks in Brookline who live in BHA properties. There may be people who live in BHA properties who are very supportive of the program, and there may be others who are not. And so figuring that all out and understanding that is important. And then you may already be on this thread, but the Women in Thriving group spoke at the CDICR meeting, the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, last month, I think it was. Terrific group, and we're really forthcoming around what they'd like to see from Brookline. I don't know that we talked a lot about policing. But they may have some thoughts that I think would be helpful. But they were a great group that was willing to come forward and talk about their experiences and wanted to. So that might be a good group to talk to.
Yes, all of those questions are in a document that I'm looking at right now. That's where we're going with this.
Great. And when you get your hands on the MOU,
Yeah.
I'm sure we'd all love to see it too. So if we can get that, to the task force, that kind of thing.
Yes, you were asking about the perspective of what the police gets out of it. And that was much of the conversation that happened with with Sergeant Hatchett. What I can hear from that information that we got is that, again, they are very passionate about this work and feel really proud of what they have accomplished and have some really nice stories about it. But it is also a way to balance their relationship with the community so that it is not just law enforcement. So that I think that's obvious how we all think of that it's not, but they want to be perceived as neighbors, as our community, and to be able to have a foothold in the community from their perspective benefits the community and also the police department. So I personally have a lot of questions about that. There's a description of what the purpose of, or what walk and talk officers do that has a lot of words that are not thoroughly defined in it that I want to dig into. I don't want to be the person that makes negative assumptions about that, but I really think specificity is what we need in this work.
I'd say also, if that's an important aim, then why is it particularly important in BHA, right? And getting down. Yeah. So I want to make sure if we're at 9:49. I want to make sure if folks have any questions, we won't necessarily be able to get answers to all of your questions, but if you have questions that you want to make sure the subcommittee is considering, now would be a good time to raise any of those. Feeling good? Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I now want to move on.
Can I just ask one question really quickly? So we are planning to do interviews likely off camera for anonymity purposes with people who are residents of BHA about walk and talk. And what we thought was really important was if the person agrees to record the interview and then transcribe it. Transcribing can take a long time. And if we're hopefully going to be able to get enough people who are willing to interview with us, that's a very long time spent on transcribing. And I'm just wondering if there are any, if there's any money available, if there is any person available within the Brookline administration who could potentially help us with some of that transcription.
Devin, I'm not quite sure how we got the last one done, and that might be helpful to understand.
This is Devin. So we went through town council's transcription service. I believe the total of that 3-hour hearing was around $400, but I can get the amount, the exact figure. And then we also are keeping a budget tracking sheet of how much you all are spending. And if you want to take a look at that and see if it matches up with your priorities and if that's worth the price. I don't know if other staff have the capacity to take something like that on at this time, but we can, obviously inquire.
Can I just say, you can set up Zoom so that it will automatically transcribe using, for lack of a better term, artificial intelligence, and the advisory committee does that, and it's not bad, and it greatly reduces the amount of time that it takes to do a proper transcript.
You have the ability to edit it afterwards. I'm sorry? Do you have the ability to edit it afterwards to fix the transcript? Eitan?
Yeah, Google Docs also has it's pretty straightforward, and yeah, you can edit it afterwards, but it's pretty good.
Yep.
So maybe if you can try that out, maybe just a Zoom call between two of you on the subcommittee, see if it works to meet your needs, and if it doesn't, circle back. I guess you can circle back to me, personally, and then we can see what we need to do. Great, thank you. It was a great question. All right, so next up, we have an update and discussion on the Tufts policing survey. I'm just mindful that it is 9:52 p.m. Is that Eitan, you leading that?
I didn't put it on the agenda, but I can give the update that I know about it. But did
Yes,
someone put it on?
yeah, please.
Well, I actually don't. I keep checking in with Professor Schaffner. He said that I think it's on Monday he'll get just confirmation to move forward. Yeah, everything I think is set up. He just was waiting for IRB to approve, which I think should happen on Monday. He said. I don't know whether all of the fund transfers have happened to pay for the mail vendor. Maybe someone from the town knows that, but it looks like they're going to be good to go next week unless there's some hiccup with IRB, which I doubt.
Mel, if you're there, any sense on how we are? Are we good to go on the town side? Mel may also be on a call or something.
I can confirm that we have paid the
that's
bill.
Well, that's going to be helpful. Thank you. The other thing, Eitan, if when they know, the time frame at which point, I know that sort of letters are supposed to go into people's mailboxes to encourage them to. This is the invite to do the survey. If we know that time frame, that'll help us coordinate our efforts to, on the town side to say like, hey, 25,000 residents are going to be getting this letter. If you see it, please don't put it in your junk. Pay attention to it. Please complete the survey. It'd be helpful to know that time frame when they know.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'll let you know. And I'm sure Professor Schaffner, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm sure he'll get some emails back saying, how did you get my address, this kind of thing. We expect that. That's always happens here. I think the letter actually says, we got your name and address from the town census, but I'm guessing, 25,000 letters, the town itself probably will get a couple of calls or emails saying, what is this all about? So we'll get that. There's also, this is sort of beside the point, but it's actually a good opportunity for the town to learn about the cleanliness of its file. We're going to get return mail from a large chunk of people. So I don't know if the town wants to learn about that in the process of doing this.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah. So we can do is, and maybe Devin and I can coordinate, but maybe it makes sense for us to do a press release in advance the week before saying, hey, the town is, engaging in this work through the task force to Reimagine Policing Brookline, and some residents, many residents can expect to receive a letter. Here's what it's about. And so we sort of prep folks a little bit to the extent that people pay attention to our social media and things like that. And members of the task force can share that with whatever bodies and organizations and whoever we think should know about it. Okay, great. Any questions there?
Yeah. Who drafts that press release?
That'll be, go ahead, Devin.
That is usually a combination of myself and Jordan Mayblum, who is our representative from the PR firm that we hired to help with COVID.
Okay. Are we, if this is a press release describing, is it going to be describing why they are receiving this? Are we attaching ourselves very directly to this?
I think that would definitely be our angle. I'd say this is something that the task force voted on and now it's coming out.
Mm-hmm. So does it make sense for us to lend content to that?
Yeah, that's great. I'm usually pulling teeth to get the content to get these things off the ground. So if you folks want to send, things that you definitely think should be included, then we can put together a draft and have it sent out to review.
Right, because that seems like a first point of contact for this for us as a task force, and it'd be super important to get that nailed down clearly to get exactly what I was talking about earlier. succinct way to have that delivered into the hands of many people is important to get that nailed right, communicated right.
All right, so we'll make sure we get a draft out that folks can comment on.
Devin, if you could give us a deadline at some point so we could get that to you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure obviously when the survey is going to come out, but I think the sooner the better, because we pretty much know what we want to say. This is who we are. We voted on this survey and it's coming. Please be aware of it. So, I mean, I'm not sure if a week is enough time for folks, but if you wanted to have comments to me by next Friday, and then, things that you think are critical to include, then Jordan and I can work up a draft for Monday. Again, this depends on when Aton can get us the time frame. I don't know if the survey will be coming out sooner than that, but if folks think that a week turnaround is good, we can have a draft ready by the following Monday.
Okay.
All right, it is now 9:58. We'll quickly become 9:59. If I would say we do have item for new business on the agenda. What I'm going to recommend is if anybody has any updates or anything else they'd like to share with the task force, is that you just get that sent through Devin over email to the task force. We don't have a time for a substantive discussion. I know people have hard outs at 10 o'clock, so we'll leave it there. And we will, the plan is we'll have this full task force meeting again next Friday with more opportunity for updates and maybe even some more discussion. So if there are items that you'd like to see on the agenda for next Friday, please get those to Devin at your earliest possible convenience, but certainly no later than, I would say, Tuesday evening. Is that fair, Devin, or do you need more time?
No, Tuesday evening is good. I try and post these as early as possible because I know people are looking for them. Like I try and post them on Mondays, but the posting deadline is Wednesday. So that's a good point, Raul. I can always post a calendar too within that 48-hour posting period. So if I've posted something on Monday, but you would like an addition to the agenda by Tuesday evening, I can repost essentially. So, by Monday is great, but I'll take Tuesday close of business as well.
Okay. And I know, Devin, you wanted to confirm the list of subcommittee members. Maybe that's something we can do over email as well.
Yeah, so everyone will be able to see that the draft that I have of the subcommittee members is in the overarching task force folder. If you could just email and confirm the point person for each subcommittee, if you could just send me an email and confirm that the membership is correct, that's my weekend project, is making sure your pages are fully fleshed out and ready to go for Monday.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Know that I am available to talk. So if you're running into a problem, just give me a call or send me an email and we'll get on the phone and we'll talk it through or whatever, anytime. So thank you all for your time. Please keep working the problem. I think everyone's on the right track as far as I can tell. Let us know what support you need, okay? Otherwise, we'll see you next Friday at 8 a.m., if not sooner. Thanks, everybody. Take care.